civil society, and to us as the public. Before we continue the program, I wanted to mention a few organizational items. First, we invite all attendees to look out for and respond to the poll questions. They should be popping up on your screens. That way, our participants can see who is in the room and joining us today. Second, please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A box. You should see it closer to the bottom of your screens. And we will also have a Q&A session at the end where you can raise your hand and share your question verbally as well. And then finally, third point is that discussion will take about 90 minutes. And during the presentation, we'll mute the attendees to avoid any technical issues or disruptions. However, once the Q&A session starts, you can unmute yourself and raise your hand and share your thoughts or questions with the participants. Well, thank you for answering this first question. It's great to see that we have a good representation of civil society here today, and some other organizations and some government. Wonderful. And we look forward to covering, yes, your interest in terms of what are the trends in child trafficking. With that, it is my great pleasure to invite Jurjit Debroy, Winrock's Chief of Global Programs and Development Officer, to offer opening remarks. Mr. Debroy oversees Winrock's programs in the US and globally, which include a broad portfolio of activities in agricultural development, resilience, water management, human rights, education, and environment. A native of India, he has worked in more than 38 countries across Asia, Africa, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Jurjit, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olga, for the thoughtful introduction and for inviting me to give opening remarks at this important event in recognition of World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. Good day to all of you from wherever you all are joining. I'm honored to be here with our distinguished panelists and dedicated attendees. Welcome, everyone. It is wonderful to see both familiar and new faces of champions, partners, and allies who are committed to addressing trafficking, specifically child trafficking, which is this year's World Day Against Trafficking in Persons theme. We leave no child behind in the fight against human trafficking. As we know, children are subject to various forms of trafficking, including exploitation, enforced labor and begging, online sexual abuse and exploitation, forced marriage, domestic servitude, and child soldiering. The root causes are manifold, including poverty, inadequate support of unaccompanied children, and armed conflict. Allow me to share some key facts about child trafficking. 1 in 3 victims of human trafficking globally is a child. Children represent a significant proportion of trafficking victims worldwide, with girls being disproportionately affected. Refugee, migrant, and displaced children are especially at risk of trafficking. And according to the most recent United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime Global Report on Trafficking in Persons, children are twice as likely to face violence during trafficking compared to adults. A trafficked child may not realize their experience is abusive and exploitative. While the facts are bleak, work is being done to prioritize child protection, bolster legislation, improve law enforcement, and allocate more resources to prevent and respond to child trafficking. Shortly, you will hear from 4 leading experts who work tirelessly to counter child trafficking. They are Megan Longstrom, the director of the Resilience Fund at Polaris here in Washington, D.C., Guillermo Galarza, the Vice President of Partnership and Law Enforcement Training at the International Center for Missing and Exploitative Children, ICMEC, headquartered in Alexandria, Virginia. Shakhnoza Khassanova, the director of the Legal Center for Women's Initiatives, Sana Sezim, is joining us from southern Kazakhstan. Her organization is an NGO. And Winrock's own Mohammad Nazrul Dipto, the senior manager for protection at USAID's Fight Slavery and Trafficking in Persons, FSTIP, activity in Bangladesh. The panelists will share their knowledge and expertise on how policy and community-based approaches are employed to counter child trafficking and how trauma-informed identification and care is practiced. Before I turn to my colleagues, allow me to share a bit of information about Winrock International. Winrock is a nonprofit organization that implements a portfolio of more than 100 agriculture, environment, and social development projects in over 40 countries. Created nearly 40 years ago through the philanthropy of Winthrop Rockefeller and John D. Rockefeller III, Winrock has extensive on-the-ground experience in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, and provides evidence-based solutions to some of the world's most complex problems. We began our work to counter human trafficking in 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union, and have since expanded our global portfolio of projects. In the past 30 plus years, we have implemented 35 counter-trafficking projects. At present, we implement 13 projects in 20 countries that follow the 4P approach of prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnership. In Kazakhstan's border communities, we support the children of migrant workers to improve access to services like education and reduce vulnerability to being trafficked. In Bangladesh, we work at the grassroots level to prevent and counter child marriage. In Jamaica, we have expanded and strengthened government and civil society systems to support children who have been trafficked. Winrock has also worked in commodity supply chains like cocoa, rubber, tea, tobacco, and sugarcane to reduce the worst forms of child labor. As is well documented globally, trafficking rates are not improving. Global crises, including conflict and climate change, are displacing already vulnerable communities and increasing economic disparities. The work that Winrock, our panelists, and all of you joining do shows a commitment to ending exploitation, supporting survivors from identification through reintegration, and reducing vulnerability of communities at risk for trafficking. None of us work alone. We work in partnership with survivors, persons with lived experience, community-based organizations, civil society, NGOs, INGOs, practitioners, governments, other implementers, the private sector, and donors to respond to and end trafficking. Once more, thank you for joining Winrock International as we recognize World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. We hope today's conversation inspires us all about our own role in addressing trafficking in persons, specifically child trafficking, and the ways we can work together as a global coalition. Now I turn to my colleague Olga, who represents the best of Winrock with almost 20 years of service in countering human trafficking, to introduce the experts. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Jujit, for the introduction, for the overview of the situation, some of the disturbing statistics we're working with, but also a very hopeful message of continuing collaboration and the need for our joint efforts. Thank you. Before I welcome our experts, I wanted to note that in today's discussion, we will refer to child trafficking using the internationally accepted definition, where a child is any person under the age of 18, and child trafficking as defined by the Palermo Protocol, and which includes two elements: the action of recruitment, transport, harboring, or receipt of a child, and the second element is the purpose of the action being exploitation. Unlike adult trafficking, in case of child victims, the child consent to be in an exploitative situation is irrelevant, and the use of force, coercion, fraud is not needed to meet the definition of trafficking. This recognizes that a child cannot give informed consent to his or her own exploitation, even they agree. The 2021 global estimates of modern slavery approximate that 35% of 50 million people in modern slavery are children. A recent IOM study analyzed 69,000 recorded cases of child trafficking and noted that families and friends are involved in the recruitment of more than 50% of child victims. It also notes that more than half of child victims are trafficked within their own country. Child trafficking can take different forms, as Jujit mentioned, and have profound effects and consequences for individual children, for their families, communities, and society as a whole. Next slide. I also wanted to note the key instruments that set international standards and expectations in terms of child protection and countering child trafficking. They include the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Palermo Protocol, and the ILO Convention 182, which outlines prohibition and immediate action for the elimination of the worst forms of child labor. Next slide. I think there is a delay. Before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to play a video of the survivor who was not able to join us live in person, but she happily agreed to record a message. And Anastasia Khmeleva is a survivor leader from Kazakhstan, one of the first such leaders in her country, and she is a member of Survivor Advisory Council. So Eliza, please do play her video. Thank you.
Всем здравствуйте, рада вас приветствовать. Меня зовут Анастасия. Я работаю в Winrock International на должности член консультативной группы потерпевших от торговли людьми, финансируемой Государственным департаментом США. Сегодня я хотела бы поделиться своим мнением по поводу торговли людьми, а именно детьми. Дети действительно являются особенно уязвимой группой в контексте торговли людьми. Почему же они так уязвимы? Это недостаток опыта и знаний, да? То есть детьми очень легко манипулировать и очень легко к чему-то принудить. Они не всегда осознают всю сложность ситуации, ну и просто, в принципе, из-за особенностей развития, да, не могут постоять за себя. Также семейная дисфункция. Дети, растущие в неблагополучных семьях, очень часто ищут любовь на другой стороне, то есть не в семье, а у людей, которые проявляют к ним заботу, ласку, и это может тоже также негативно повлиять и сделать их подверженными к торговле детьми. Я бы хотела, чтобы рассмотрели мои рекомендации. То есть я тут себе сделала заметки для правительства. ужесточение законодательства, ввести более строгие законы и наказания за торговлю людьми. То есть у нас в стране не так давно принялся закон, и я считаю, что очень много нужно над чем работать и продвигать в принципе это. Также обучение правоохранительных органов. Очень важно, чтобы правоохранительные органы знали, как работать именно с детьми, ибо у них неустойчивая психика, и они в связи с тем, что у них неустойчивая психика, они могут закрыться в себе, да, и дело, в принципе, дальше не пойдет. Также могут их запугивать. Им нужно обеспечить психологическую помощь, да, то есть создать для них безопасную среду. Улучшение координации. Нужно создать межведомственные рабочие группы, которые будут координировать усилия различных министерств и агентств по борьбе с торговлей людьми. И поддержка жертв, да, ну не только детей, да, но и их родителей, потому что со стороны общества это часто очень сильное давление, что в принципе может помешать в принципе продвижению дела в суд и спокойно смотреть на эту обстановку, да, то есть трезвым взглядом. Для неправительственных организаций проводить кампании по повышению осведомленности, да, то есть у нас в Казахстане такая работа уже проводится, также я принимаю в этом участие, да, совместно с НПО, да, разными организациями, где также обучаем госорганы, да, и я даю какие-то свои рекомендации по работе с жертвами. Образовательных учреждений хотелось бы, чтобы как-то внедрить в учебную программу, да, эту тему, потому что она не так маловажна для общества. Дети в школе, дети в колледжах, да, то есть они в принципе не знают, что это такое. То есть повышение осведомленности среди школы, ну, в принципе, учебных заведений, считаю, что это будет очень полезно. Также создание безопасной среды, создать механизмы, позволяющие детям и подросткам сообщать о таких случаях, да. То есть также можно везде, во всех всевозможных мессенджерах распространить номера, да, где ребенок, в принципе, мог бы позвонить, да, что если ему что-то кажется, что не так, чтобы он мог об этом сообщить и не боялся. Иными словами, чтобы они, наоборот, не подавляли это, а как-то пытались помочь. Семьи, для семей. Сейчас очень распространен вебкам-моделинг. И я считаю, что детям, ну, родителям детей очень важно контролировать этот процесс, так как чтобы его ребенка не втянули в сексуальное рабство, да. Будем говорить о том, что девочки, да, подростки очень часто работают в этой сфере просто потому, что они как-то не общались с родителями, им охота какой-то дополнительный заработок, они там не хотят у родителей брать деньги, да, то есть они подходят уже к такому возрасту, да, девочки от 13 лет, от 14 лет, то есть очень-очень много случаев в этом. Соответственно, они там продают там свои какие-то фотографии, а потом их начинают... Первое время им, конечно же, будут платить, а потом начинают, да, их шантажировать. Вот сейчас мы скинем твои фотографии, твои видео твоим родителям. И ребенок, в принципе, из-за чувства стыда может также дальше торговать, иными словами, своим телом, да, то есть в интернет-мессенджерах. Так, и очень нужно и важно родителям поддерживать своих детей. Ни в коем случае, если родитель узнал, что с его ребенком что-то случилось, как большинство, ну, обвиняют, они обвиняют детей, да, вот ты так, и дети начинают закрываться, а потом они опять же будут уязвимы, да, то есть они опять же попадут в такую ситуацию, они могут сбежать из дома, да, то есть когда ты находишься на улице, тебе хочется кушать, там тебе хочется то, да, то есть многие избегают. И они ищут заработок любыми путями, потому что, то есть, это жизненно необходимый фактор, да, еда, вода и так далее. Так, для сообщества, в принципе, да, что, в принципе, обычные люди могут сделать, да, то есть это создать волонтерское движение. У нас, по-моему, такого нет еще, но хотелось бы, чтобы было. То есть развитие программы менторства, организация программ менторства для уязвимых детей с целью предоставления им поддержки и наставничества. То есть это очень важно. Очень важно ребенку знать, что он не один и что ему помогут. Да? То есть, к сожалению, если это случилось, я как сама бывшая жертва, да, которая побывала в этой ситуации, это очень важно, да? Поддержка, не осуждение со стороны общества. То есть если будет осуждение, ничего не будет, а может быть и не будет даже самого того ребенка. То есть психика неустойчива, и не дай бог он может что-то с собой сделать.
Thank you so much, Eliza, for playing the video, and thank you to Anastasia for taking the time to record the message and to prepare and share her experience. She works at the shelter in support of protection of survivors. She also trains frontline officials in trafficking identification. So she's a really active advocate and champion in her country. Well, finally, I'm very thrilled to introduce our esteemed speakers today. The first one is Megan Longstrom. She's the director of the Resilience Fund at Polaris. The fund provides direct cash assistance to survivors across the United States. Prior to joining Polaris, Megan founded and ran a national survivor-led nonprofit providing evidence-based outreach, intervention, and economic empowerment initiatives to individuals experiencing sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. Ms. Longstrom is a network consultant through the U.S. Department of State, contributing to the annual Trafficking in Persons report, as well as other training and educational materials. Megan is a subject matter expert on topics including evidence-based, survivor-centered program design, financial crimes related to trafficking, and the misuse of technology by trafficking operations. Our second speaker is Guillermo Galarza, who serves as the Vice President for the Partnerships and Law Enforcement Training at the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, also known as ICMEC. He leads the organization's worldwide law enforcement and criminal justice training program to investigate child sexual exploitation and abuse. Guillermo has facilitated training in over 120 countries, and more than 60,000 experts have attended his courses in person. Guillermo is using ICMEC's model framework to create police units dedicated to online child exploitation and leads ICMEC's strategic partnerships with industry, governments, and international alliances. Our third speaker, Shakhnoza Khassanova, is joining us from southern Kazakhstan, where she directs the Legal Center for Women's Initiative, Sana Sezim. She has been coordinating programs to combat human trafficking and support safer labor migration for 15 years. Through her organization, she supports criminal cases of human trafficking, provides psychological support to survivors, conducts training for representatives of law enforcement and government agencies, and mentors other counter-trafficking organizations. She is a member of the Human Rights Commission under the President of the Republic of Kazakhstan and 2021 US State Department TIP Report Hero. And our final speaker is Mr. Nazrul Islam Dipto, Senior Manager for Protection with the USAID-funded Freedom from Slavery and Trafficking program that is implemented by Winrock. He has been working in the development and humanitarian sectors, focusing on child protection for over 15 years. His expertise includes trafficking in persons, child protection, and youth engagement and advocacy. His efforts resulted in the adoption of comprehensive survivor service guidelines by the Ministry of Social Welfare. Prior to Winrock, Dipto worked on the response to the Rohingya displacement crisis, and he also deployed to Mozambique for cyclone response and to Indonesia for system strengthening in relation to unaccompanied and separated children. Thank you all for making the time today. Now, first I would like to turn to Megan. It would be great to hear about Polaris and your organization, and what are the most common forms of child trafficking that you see in the United States? And perhaps if you could share some facts and observations in terms of unique experience of child trafficking survivors. Thank you, Megan.
Yes, thank you, Olga, and good morning. I am with Polaris, and most people know Polaris as running the National Human Trafficking Hotline here in the United States. And Polaris does actually so much more than just the hotline. So our work can be kind of described in three main categories, the first of which is direct response, which includes the hotline and the Resilience Fund. The second category of work Polaris engages in is research and intelligence, and this is done through our learning and innovation team and our financial intelligence unit. And then finally, the third area of work that Polaris engages in, both nationally and at the state and local levels, are campaigns and public engagement, including policy and advocacy work. So when it comes to child trafficking here in the United States, Polaris focuses our work within the US, but also has partnerships with countries around the world where survivors have come from either before or during their exploitation. And so very quickly, I just want to share a few trends that we have seen, particularly relating to child labor trafficking here in the United States over the past several years. So first of all, through the National Human Trafficking Hotline, over the past decade, the number of signals regarding child labor exploitation coming through calls has remained fairly consistent, and it's around 3% of the total labor trafficking signals that the hotline receives every year. Secondly, child labor trafficking continues to intersect with other crimes, most notably narcotics production, smuggling, and distribution, and many child victims also experience forced criminality during their trafficking. Thirdly, the child labor trafficking here in the United States happens to children of all genders and disproportionately impacts children of color. And then lastly, the most common risk factor in identified cases of child labor exploitation is recent relocation or migration, followed by involvement in the child welfare system or being a missing or unhoused youth. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you, Megan, for sharing, reminding us that Polaris, the many different directions that you're working on, and also reminding about the connection between child trafficking and other crimes, including drug trafficking and other criminal activities. We know that sexual exploitation of children is one of the worst forms and most traumatic forms of trafficking. And it can take different forms, including commercial sexual exploitation, pornography, sexual servitude, and the online sexual exploitation became even more prevalent since COVID-19, when everything shifted from real world to digital. Guillermo, I know that ICMEC focuses on the sexual exploitation of children globally. Would you be able to share what you're observing in terms of dynamics of child rape crimes and how the development of ICT technologies has been affecting or altering the ways how children are being recruited, exploited, and rescued?
Thank you so much, Olga. And it's a pleasure to be here today. So let me set my timer because I have 5 minutes. So yes, my name is Guillermo Galarza, and I manage the international law enforcement trainings and partnerships at the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Really, before I begin, the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, ICMEC, is a global organization really focusing on the terms of child sexual exploitation. As we know, the exploitation in many countries, the online child sexual exploitation in many countries, it is a modality of trafficking. Some of the issues that we cover on this room is really the online child sexual exploitation, as some of the countries define as child pornography. We also cover what is called grooming, sextortion, commercial exploitation, and abductions. These are all modalities of trafficking. Now, one of the challenges, or some of the challenges that we are seeing globally, is that we understand this is a complex topic because it involves very intricate, complex networks. As we look at the child trafficking and the online child sexual exploitation, it is often a transnational crime involving the ITC. Of course, now children go online, they go on some of these online platforms, they go on gaming platforms. This is where all of these platforms, there are a lot of these child sex offenders, these criminal organizations really luring and looking for the most vulnerable. These are often all children. Some of the challenges are that there's lack of awareness, issues related to online child sexual exploitation and online activities is often a taboo issue. And that's the reality. It's never going to happen to our children. Our children are often in a safe environment, like our home. But a lot of times, the parents are not aware that the minute that the children have access to technology, they're opening the door for vulnerable groups, child sex offenders, and often these children are vulnerable. And it is very important that we address awareness among families, among children, and among schools as well. Some of the other challenges are the lack of legislation, which is a major gap as we're trying to address ITC and online child sexual exploitation. Often, a lot of the countries, there's not enough resources to develop prevention and awareness campaigns. Now, I really also want to talk about some of the myths, because it's important to tackle what are the myths when it comes to online child sexual exploitation. We often think that this happens in developing world, but it doesn't happen in developing world. It happens all over, even in the United States, in advanced world, where children are more susceptible to have access to technology. That's where most of this crime is happening. These children, these victims, are often victims of sextortion. This leads to entrapment. This leads to forced child sexual exploitation and many other factors that involves raising awareness, involves training, and really involves that the parents are aware of what the dangers of the internet are. Some of the other myths are only young children are affected, only young girls are affected as trafficking. And it is not true. Children and boys and girls are also subjectable to trafficking in persons, especially when we're dealing with technologies and so on. One of the other common myths that we often see is that trafficking victims are often unfamiliar with the traffickers. And that is one of the most common myths, because a lot of the times children are going to be befriended by a friend or someone who they think they know. Often they're strangers. Often there's someone close to the children. It could be their uncles. It could be a boyfriend of the spouse. Someone that's in a close contact with the children that may be able to abuse them and put their images online. Those are often the traffickers, are the people that are gonna exchange those bad practices with the children. So anyway, I think these are just some of the common practices that we're seeing. There's much more to discuss, but I just wanted to keep it in a good time frame. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you, Guillermo. I appreciate your dispelling some of the myths that are present in terms of gender vulnerability and, some countries being more affected or exposed to than others to specifically online sexual exploitation. And of course, the fact that we need to catch up in terms of prevention and education and resources to detect and prevent these crimes. Thank you. We also know that refugees, children of migrants, and unaccompanied children are among those most at risk for different types of exploitation because they don't always have sufficient social networks and access to basic things like education and services and trusted individuals. Shakhnoza, I know your organization works in the region of Kazakhstan that borders into other countries with relatively open borders and where there's a lot of internal and cross-border migration. I'm curious to hear what forms of child trafficking you see and what gender, age profiles do you encounter in your work?
Thank you. Good day, dear participants of this virtual meeting on such a significant day, International Day Against Trafficking Persons. As Olga said before, I'm director of NGO, which is located in South Kazakhstan. Our organization was established in 2001 and works in the field human rights protections according to the 3 priorities. This is access to justice, stop trafficking, and labor migration. Of course, today, the topics which we are discussing is very important for us. All our work to combat human trafficking, including child trafficking, is carried out according to the 4 Ps. This is approach, yes, prosecutions, protections, preventions, and partnerships, which is mentioned before our experts. Within this 4P approach, we provide direct assistance to victims, including minors, using a victims-centered approach. From 2019 to March 2024, we implemented the national project Together Against Human Trafficking through capacity building of civil society organization with the support of the US Department of State. And this project was agreed between the governments of 2 countries, Kazakhstan and USA. And the national project covered 11 cities in Kazakhstan, where lawyers provided direct assistance to victims regardless of citizenships. Over the last 5 years, we and our project partners have identified 826 victims in Kazakhstan, out of the minors 11. When we talk about types of child trafficking, it is important to mention that underage girls are mainly exploited in sexual exploitation, as well as online sexual exploitation. In the field of begging, both boys and girls are involved. There are also facts of selling children for purpose of illegal adoption. In terms of nationality, the analysis of our applications to NGOs showed that 87% of victims of human trafficking, including children, were foreigners, including citizenship from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and the Kyrgyz Republic. And there were also parents of child victims with undocumented citizenships who had either Soviet-style passports or undocumented persons. As for children, children of migrants may also face similar rights violations. Taking into account that our organization is located in south of Kazakhstan with a border with the Republic of Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, we record a large of facts of involved of migrants' children in sexual and labor exploitation, as well as the spheres of begging. However, it is presently to the problem of trafficking in human beings, especially children, that remains urgent for our country. Today, the government of Kazakhstan, together with civil society and international organization, is doing a very big job to combat this crime. The first thing I would like to note is the adoption of separate national law on combating human trafficking in Kazakhstan. Literally on July 5, 2024, the president of our country signed the law. This law will for the first time provide for new concepts who the victims are, what rights they have, consider the comprehensive of the all subjects of human trafficking. And it is important to note that a separate chapter is provided in the law for protections of rights for minor victims. Second, I would like also mention about work of international organizations, in particular Winrock International, which in 2023 launched a large program aimed specifically at protecting victims of child trafficking in southern regions of Kazakhstan, with the support, of course, US Department of State. This program is first ever project in Kazakhstan that focuses extremely just on prevention of trafficking in children and the protection of child victims and children at risk. Two national NGOs, including our organizations and NGO Radnik, have been selected as resources partners for this program. The approach of this program will lead to systematic change by strengthening the capacity of local organizations to expand services to child TIP victims, and by mobilizing government and civil society leaders to coordinate and improve the accountability of child protection system at organizations level. Of course, I would like to mention about new also one of the job or work of our country. In May 2026, this program for the first time in Kazakhstan created survivors of trafficking advisors group because child tip prevention and protection projects are most effective when informed and implemented by those who survived it. Just now we see video where our victims of survivors also working with us, and it is very important. Of course, despite the fact that a huge amount of work being done, we have certain challenges. Among them were, first, the problem of child trafficking has not been sufficiently studied. Second, there is no algorithm for comprehensive assistance to victims of child trafficking by all interested parties. Third, low detection of victims of child trafficking. We need to change and we need to add all necessary questions when we work with child trafficking issues. And fourth, there are insufficient clearly guidelines and legislations regarding rehabilitations and reintegrations services for victims of child trafficking. When I talk about the statistics before, I mentioned 11 children have been as survivors. 5 of them was victims of sexual exploitations. 2 of them was begging, and other numbers was victims of labor exploitations. This kind of victims we have, unfortunately, when we talk about age, of course, if we talk about girls, it could be between 7 and 17. When we talk about boys, it could be from 6 until 12. Thank you.
Thank you, Shakhnoza. Thank you for sharing what you see in Kazakhstan, and congratulations on the new law. And it's great to hear there are special provisions for minors in it. And it seems like you're one of the pioneers working on the issue of child trafficking specifically. So best of luck to your organization and others in developing the referral mechanisms and other procedures for child victims specifically. Our next speaker, Dipto, he's joining from Bangladesh, and I'm very thankful that he is able to, despite the issues with internet connection over the past week. And please know that we think of your country and are sorry for all the lives that were lost in the recent protest, Dipto. We know that you have been working in child protection for many years. Could you please share what do you see as the root causes and enabling factors for child trafficking, including forced child labor and forced marriage in Bangladesh?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Olga. So Do you hear me? It's clear. I'm just confused a bit about the sound because here bandwidth is very low.
Yes, we can hear you well.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, yeah, so you already introduced me that I'm working here in a project. It's called Fight Slavery and Trafficking Persons. Right now in Bangladesh, under Winrock International, we have 3 projects working for countering trafficking persons. So, as thing is that human trafficking is a serious issue, and everyone, including men, women, children, and people with diverse sexual orientation, actually common targets for the traffickers. This is common in everywhere, and but when the questions of children comes, they are the probably most vulnerable and oppressed group. So in my discussion, I tried to portray the picture of child and forced labor, which is the forms of child trafficking, and also child forced marriage, which is a strong driver for the child trafficking. So, in order to understand the society we live in here, we have to look at the socio-economic and cultural practices. Despite the country gradual, you see in Bangladesh the gradual economic development, many people in the family, but the thing is that many people and families still remain under the poverty line. The poverty situation further worsened when the child's vulnerability sometimes because of the lack of awareness and sometimes due to cultural norms and practices. If I give you an example, when a family in a poverty is taken, parents are hardly able to feed their children. And the thing is that on that time, actually, that impacted on the children, and in the result, the boys and girls are put into the forced labor and hope for bringing a little earning to reduce the plight of the poverty-stricken family. Or the girls is married off, and the second thing is the girls is married off to get rid of a mouth to feed. I'm actually telling you based on the practical experience working in the grounds, in the different districts in Bangladesh, particularly during the COVID pandemics, we have seen how much child forced marriage and child forced labor increase in Bangladesh. During the pandemic, a survey was carried out by one of our partners, and we found that in that survey that in Satkira there is 2 districts. In the Satkira district there is 2 Upazila, that is sub districts. All of the children grades 6 to 10 are married off, and this was the reality. So this manifests the statement I made at the outset that families in the first place want to get rid of a girl mouth to feed, and that is the easiest way. Actually, in that situation, children are helpless and they have nothing to say to this world and the decision maker of their family. The thing is that COVID already over, but by and large situation remains the same. Maybe the magnitude has reduced a little bit, but the statistic is still very hard touching, here in Bangladesh. And this is the harsh reality. And this is such a harsh reality that government itself here in Bangladesh could not deny the rise of these 2 human rights violation factors of children. And you already know that I also work in Rohingya response, and I would like to unfold one more dimension that here in Bangladesh, more than 1 million Rohingya people living in a makeshift in a camp in Bangladesh, and these 2 factors like child forced marriage and child forced labor are rampant in those camps. You can find hundreds, thousands of reports published in newspaper, but I'm sharing from my experience that I have seen in my working experience in Cox's Bazar that Rohingya girls often married even to an unknown person, and they use the sea route to taking their life risks in a hope that one day they will meet his or her husband in Malaysia to be united with her husband, and who is probably working in Malaysia. So it would be good to inform all of you that considering the prevalence of forced child marriage, in globally Bangladesh is ranked 8 and in South Asia is first. So in a nutshell, if I say here as a root cause, like poverty is one of the major root causes of both forced child marriage and child labor. Beside that, here social insecurity of girl child in the community and all of the sectors, cultural and customary practices that includes maybe the religion, the beliefs, dowry, and other social pressure to a girl, and the gender discrimination, which is very common here as a root cause of child marriage. Besides that, actually, the government and weak government system and improper implementation of the law act as an enabling factor for child forced marriage. And you maybe know that, like in Bangladesh, this is the highest rate of child marriage that is in South Asia. I already shared that 51.4% according to UNICEF report 2023. And it says like 51.4% 4% child be married or before celebrate their 18th birthday. And the twisting thing is like here in Bangladesh, maybe in also other countries, we found that traffickers use this child marriage as a strategy or means to traffic them, primarily for sex trafficking. And if I say in case of labor, child forced labor, here is one of the most important causes like poverty again. Besides the poverty, actually lack of quality educations, social norms in some area, and cheap labor market, because you know it's easy for a recruiter to recruit a children very low wage. So the cheap labor is another area that is actually increase the forced labor. And weak legal enforcement also allow child labor in many sectors, including here informal sector. You found many children in old Dhaka and downtown, they are like working in informal sector with a very worse conditions. So I think I cover both issue, and I would like to stop here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dipto. Thank you for covering the some sober statistics and the fact that Bangladesh holds the first place in South Asia for child marriage, and unfortunately that food insecurity affects girls in particular, forcing families to marry off their daughters, and which is used by traffickers for sexual exploitation. Thank you for noting regarding vulnerability of Rohingya in particular and the exploitation that may be happening in camps. I wanted to remind everyone that we do have Q&A box down below. If you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to go and add them there. Now, and I would like to switch gears a little bit and talk about solutions and approaches that participating experts have seen and should be considered when addressing the many complex causes and drivers and factors and consequences of child trafficking. We're a little bit behind time, so I would really appreciate if our speakers hold their answers up 3-4 minutes if possible. Megan, I'll start with you. What do you see as most important considerations for successful reintegration and recovery of child survivors? And what kind of approaches and services are critical when working with survivors and families and communities?
Thank you, Olga. So when it comes to solutions, there's kind of two pieces that Polaris looks at. So we look at the response aspect, and then we also look at the prevention component. So when it comes to responding to child trafficking, Polaris, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, does report any and all instances of child abuse, neglect, or trafficking to law enforcement, and also child welfare as required by US law. The hotline is also able to provide referrals to resources for child survivors. I think it's really important to remember that child trafficking does not exist in a vacuum. It's part of a larger system of issues. And these systems exploit vulnerabilities. When it comes to labor exploitation, these systems exploit worker vulnerabilities specifically. The systems lack accountability and do not sufficiently protect workers. And so this is where exploitation is going to occur to any vulnerable individual, and children are one of the most vulnerable populations that are impacted by those systems failures. Polaris is also very committed to preventing child trafficking from occurring in the first place. And what we know from research here in the United States, coming out of Polaris's national survivor study that was conducted over the last several years, is that 43% of survivors in the United States are living below the poverty line, and they are supporting families of 2 to 3 individuals, often children, on that income. And that is where the Resilience Fund was born out of, was these findings and this knowledge that economic insecurity and financial destabilization is one of the most critical risk factors for someone to be trafficked in the future. The Resilience Fund is a direct cash assistance program for adult survivors of trafficking in the United States. However, 1/3 of the inaugural cohort recipients have children who live in their household. Most of these individuals have an average of 2 children per household, and they are actually, their average income is 32% lower than the federal poverty line. So we know that these children are incredibly high risk just because of the economic situation of their families. And so direct cash assistance can help stabilize survivors after exploitation, but can also be viewed as a preventative initiative for future child exploitation. When it comes to one of the most common forms of child exploitation that we see here in the United States, it is familial trafficking. And this abuse and exploitation tends to be normalized within the family culture. And that impact has significant implications for the child's healing and stability post-exploitation, as their family of origin is not part of their healthy support system after exit. And furthermore, this form of interpersonal trauma can cause many survivors to have very little trust with those around them, including helping professionals who may represent systems who did not see them during their exploitation or who failed them during that time. Lastly, I just want to highlight that the #1 access point for help during trafficking is a friend or a family member, and generally speaking, a trusted adult that has ongoing contact with a child. And so while this may be a family member, it may also be a caseworker or a professional, such as somebody in the juvenile justice system. For survivors of child exploitation, the priority need is safety. And from there are additional education gaps for child survivors, particularly those who have survived familial exploitation. And to end my comments on a slightly more hope-filled note, child survivors need the opportunity to have fun and experience childhood as it is intended to be. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you for mentioning both kind of systemic responses that Polaris is doing at the level of hotline, and of course the Resilience Fund that provides critical, bridge and services for survivors for living in poverty, and also noting that sometimes all a child needs is a trusted adult. I think that was the message from the earlier speaker as well. We know that justice responses, it's recognized that prosecutions are an effective deterrent for trafficking crimes. And we know that impunity and unresolved cases may re-traumatize victims and create an environment where more exploitation can happen. So I'm curious to hear from Guillermo in terms of how should child trafficking criminal cases be handled to protect survivors, prevent re-traumatization, and what are the new forms of evidence and approaches that are being used during investigations and in court to convict the traffickers?
Thank you so much, Anna. So one of the key, I want to say, challenges, opportunities, or weaknesses is sort of the lack of sort of prosecution training and law enforcement training, especially when it comes to this type of crime. Why? Because now we're dealing with this sort of the digital evidence, the chain of custody. Where did the crime happen? where's the victim, where's the evidence, where's the perpetrator. So I think really if we divide this into sort of a multifaceted approach, right, where we look at child protection systems, I believe, and this is some areas that we have seen, in many countries there are lack of national protection frameworks, national protection systems as well. So I think in countries that they have or they have not, they may have lack of legal protection frameworks. So I think one of the areas that we should strengthen or approach as we're looking at national capacity building is how do we strengthen these legal frameworks, these national protection frameworks. And the way we look at this is a sort of a two-pronged approach. There's a preventive element and there's a protective element. On the preventive element, yes, you have to have monitoring services, you have to have dedicated reporting hotlines, you have to have statistics and data collection, you have to have services for the victims, but in many cases, yes, also the perpetrators as well. On the proactive element, there has to be monitoring and evaluation systems. They have to be training for prosecutors, multidisciplinary trainings, and also for law enforcement as well. Also, as far as when it comes to safe places, having shelters and safe houses are so crucial to prevent the re-victimization and that sort of the victim-centric approach, making sure that we have reunification for these victims as well. On the prosecution side, of course, it's always very important to have that specialized units. One of the challenges that we've seen globally is that when it comes to online child sexual exploitation, child protection, and or trafficking, there's no specialized units. And when these crimes happen and they get reported to, say, law enforcement, where does this crime happen? So does it go to juveniles? Does it go to family services? So what I'm trying to say is that in a lot of these countries within the police agencies, there's no specialized unit that manages trafficking of children. So really developing that specialization is crucial to combat online child sexual exploitation. Also, I think the legal support for victims. A lot of these victims simply don't have the legal assistance and the legal support. And in many ways, this is a flaw in the systems. This is something that we should actually try to engage to make sure that these victims have those legal supports when it comes to representation in court. I also think that developing those partnerships with other NGOs, international organizations is crucial, that international cooperation. As we know, this crime has no borders. And now, on top of that, you add the technology component. Again, who has jurisdiction? Where did the crime happen? Where's the victim? Now with all these new technologies like AI, generation, and so on, is it even a real crime? Adding the component of the virtual reality that actually is possessing a big challenges and a big issues right now. Live streaming. Some of the countries, the children don't have to be coerced or moved from one location to another location. The actual abuse, the actual crime happens at one location and is virtually transmitted all over the world. So these are the nuances and the challenges that we're seeing globally. And I think by developing enhanced training for law enforcement, for prosecutors, and for all justice officials is a key component and a critical gap as we're trying to address these issues. Lastly, I want to ensure that community involvement is crucial. If you see it, report it. And there are a lot of awareness and prevention campaigns that need to be put into place as we're looking at trafficking in children. And this is something that we need to really focus or work. So thank you.
Thank you, Guillermo. Thank you for reminding us, what difficult type of crime it is, involving many layers and of offenders even. And so it's the specialized unit are important to be in place and to be trained to know how to handle this particular type of crime. And of course, the importance of having legal aid for survivors and safe places and community involvement and support. Thank you. One of the most challenging aspect of counter-trafficking, and Megan noted it, is creating the channels of trust and an environment in which survivors feel comfortable to come forward and ask for help. Shakhnoza, to what extent have you found that child survivors, when they're facing frontline officials or agencies, may be mislabeled or misunderstood and taken as difficult teenagers or children in conflict with law due to some of the potential aggressive behaviors they may display, or the fact that they may change story due to trauma, or sometimes they want to protect the perpetrators? And what kind of policies and activities you've seen that show success in offering assistance to child survivors?
Thank you for your very important questions. First of all, I would like to say that it is very important to carry out correct identifications, as in practice, there are cases when children of migrants may be considered as violators of migrants' legislations, not of their own free will, may be prosecuted and may be deported. Employers do not timely register migrants' families internationally, and when defending their rights, do not take into account the fact that migrants who were exploited did not have the opportunity to register on their own because the employers took away the documents, held them, and did not allow them to move. In this case, it is very important that parents of migrants' children apply to the police with a statement so that they are recognized as the victims of human trafficking beings. And on this base of this, they were not able to pass migration registration and thus are exempt from liability and deportations. Or when we are talking about a case where there has been a sale of children for those purposes of illegal adoption, it is also important to identify correctly. After all, when we talk about human trafficking, we know that the ultimate goal is exploitation. Accordingly, there must be a correct qualifications of the crime. With this in mind, it is important to conduct training activities for all professionals.
Thank you, Shakhnoza. Thank you for sharing the examples of when migrant children may be and their families may be fined or deported for breaking migration laws and not being identified as trafficking survivors, and that continuous training is needed. Thank you. We know also that survivor-centered, age-appropriate, and gender-sensitive approaches are important to successful rehabilitation. Over the past several years, the importance and engagement of survivor leaders in counter-trafficking has become even more recognized and prominent, and it's wonderful. Dipto, what are the approaches to rehabilitation of child survivors that you have seen as effective, and in the context of the conversation on survivor inclusion, how do you see survivors and children being engaged and contribute to policies regarding child trafficking in particular?
Thank you again, Olga. So yes, it's from our experience, we see that in Bangladesh, where the community-based child protection committee, so this is a very the down level, like the lowest unit of the administration, it's like village level. So where we found that community-based child protection committee is functional, we found that community-based child protection mechanism proving to be as a successful there. So thing is that in all of the areas of Bangladesh, it is not functional. This is depend on the local level leaders who are actually responsible for doing it. And we also found here in Bangladesh, so when we send any messages regarding the protections or areas of any kind of messages from child to child approach, it was one of the big success here we see in Bangladesh. Beside that, in any issues like for any rights issue or claiming any rights, here when we go through a joint collaboration with other, if it is like related to the city issues, if it's like to the city, then when we jointly go with the advocacy with other stakeholders who are working in this area, then this was really a successful issue here in Bangladesh. We see that in Bangladesh there is no safe or shelter home for the trafficking survivor. We from our project we have like a few shelter home where when we found that any children are their home is not safe and they are come to shelter home, they go through many kind of like services like their counseling, their health, and many kind of supported, and it is really good for them to reintegrate it into their society. So in the government sector, still though government in a position to establish a shelter home, but still there is no shelter home available for the trafficking survivor. And the thing is that regarding the rehabilitations in for the forced labor, for the forced child marriage, this project we are working as Joyjit said, like FSTEP is working for the child forced marriage. We provide them for the victim all of the holistic protection services with a focus of continuation of their education. And though through this approach, actually our project has been successful in advancing these children into a educated youth. If I give you an example, then this is really a good success that this year 2 of our survivor children graduated from high school level with a distinction. And one of our survivor who got enrolled in a public medical school, which is even difficult for the children from well-off family. And our project, we always consulted with child survivor in a design and development of the work plan. And also we, in our program designing, when we implement our activities at the field level, we also include children in that activities. And actually it helps them to own the things. Here, like I hear from about the Kazakhstan, there is survivor advisor board here, Bangladesh. Since 2011, we are working with Onirban. Onirban means the film never end. This is a survey network of the trafficking survivor. It's a big platform actually to raise the voice of survivor and claim their rights. Here is around 10 chapters of Onirban available in Bangladesh, and 7 of them are registered by government. So why I talking about the Onirban? Because they have the life experience. So when they take an initiative from local to the national level, so government, donor, and international organization, many actually they pay their attention. So they actually doing very well in the national and local level to combating trafficking. I can recently, like I can give you an example. In Bangladesh, there is a national plan of action for the prevention and suppression of human trafficking, and Onirban member was there, and they actually input many things. Actually, what like kind of national plan of action would be for the trafficking survivor, as because they are the they have the life experience, so government actually had them very well. And another good news is like that recently the Alamin Noyon, you already maybe know that Alamin Noyon recently got the recently awarded as a TIF Hero 2024, and he is the central member, president of Onirban member. Central Onirban president. So yeah, in a large nutshell, I just if I wrap up that, like community-based child protection mechanism coordination, effective coordination, and child-to-child approach, engage the live experience person in the procedure and the policy making. It could be actually a great for a successful and what we have found here in Bangladesh. In a nutshell, this is my discussion regarding child engagement to contribute to policy and procedure regarding counter-trafficking persons. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dipto. Thank you highlighting the community child protection committees as an effective mechanism for coordination and for accountability at the local level. And it's also great to hear, of course, about Anirban, one of the pioneer survivor organizations in the world, and their role in the prevention at the community level, but also in the advocacy at the national and international levels. Thank you. And I wanted to thank again our panelists today for your insights and contributions. In terms of solutions, what I heard is it's really important to develop trust and a mechanism for trust for identifying and assisting child trafficking survivors. Financial, cash, education assistance, legal support are all very critical. We need to continue working on prevention in terms of education, but also integrating specific solutions for technology, facilitated exploitation and elements of exploitation. And I think everyone highlighted the importance of community involvement, because that's where the people safety networks are, and how victims can get support and how people can be protected from potential exploitative situations. We have just one last poll questions for our attendees today here. And meanwhile, I would like to invite Nina Etimizyan, Winrock's Associate Vice President of Human Rights, Education, and Empowerment to close. Oh, apologies, we have Q&A session. I'm sorry, we have last question, and I'll hand over to Rachel De Leon, my colleague here, who will, she's been looking at the Q&A box, and also feel free to raise your hands. Rachel?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Olga, and thank you again to our panelists for the insights that you shared. It was very interesting. We do have one question already in the Q&A function. So as participants, I'm not sure if you can access the chat, but you should be able to access the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to drop any additional questions in there. And as Olga said, you can also raise your hand and we're happy to call on you. So I think the question that we have right now in the Q&A is for our colleague Dipto. This person said that Dhaka and other big cities in Bangladesh are growing rapidly. A lot of middle-class families are interested in domestic workers, and oftentimes these positions are filled by teenage girls, some of whom have been trafficked from rural areas of Bangladesh and are often exploited by their domestic employers. The Bangladeshi law that prosecutes domestic servitude cases was passed in 1961, which is actually before Bangladesh was a country. So my question is, although there are no specific laws to prosecute domestic servitude exploitation cases, how do the NGOs and other professionals working on children's rights prosecute these types of crimes in Bangladesh? Dipto, is that something you'd like to respond to?
Yeah, I would like to respond. So thing is that here is talk about the teenage girls. So teenage, if sometimes from 13 to 19, so it is over 18, then they will not cover the Child Protection Act. So there is a act in Bangladesh that is like a Child Rights Act or Child Act. So in that act, actually, if anyone engaged in domestic servitude and abuse or any kind of things happen with that girls or boy, then there is a remedy. But thing is that there is no, actually it is true that there is no policy right now, but government has an order, it's called GO, to work with them, and the organizations who are working here, many organizations working here for the child protection issues, they actually advocacy with the government to doing this policy. And as a NGO, actually, the domestic servitude who are under 18, that will cover the law, and we can go using that law or inform the respective authority. And if it is not, if it is like more than 18, then actually we can go through the government order and support them. Yeah, and this is actually a big area now. Many organizations who are working for the child protection, they are actually advocating in government for a law for the domestic servitude. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Dipto. Looks like we have another question in the chat. How can children participate in counter-trafficking efforts? And I might ask if Megan, are you interested in responding to this one?
I can reply very briefly. I love that this question was asked, and would be interested to hear from any colleagues who have input as well. I think anytime survivors can be centered in informing projects and programs and initiatives, it can be very meaningful both for the individual in their healing journey and as in terms of informing the best way forward.
Thanks, Megan. I would also love to hear from other colleagues. Guillermo, would you like to respond to this one as well?
Sure, and thank you so much for asking that question. And I think it's really important to get children, possible, unfortunately, that have been victims, to be influencers, because that's how children understand one another. And I've seen it in many countries that institutions, organizations, they work with children to be influences to another. Again, I think we're talking about the issue of awareness, prevention, and education. And what a better way to use an influencer at that in that age sort of gap or age bracket to really talk to other children about the prevalence and the issues of education and prevention. So I think that's a very good question as well.
Thanks so much, Guillermo. We have just one more minute and one more question. Shakhnoza, I would love to hear from you on the last question that was just dropped in the chat. So one of our colleagues asked, what measures are considered to be the most effective in increasing the resilience of children to be recruited, preventing them from being recruited into trafficking?
Thanks for questions. It is very interesting and important also questions. We always need to learn that when we are working with child, we always need to use child trauma orientation approach, which is very important and to help us to provide success assistance and to help them to quick and successful rehabilitation in the society.
Thank you so much. And thank you to our colleagues for the great questions. Olga, I think that is all the questions that we've gotten so far, so maybe I can pass it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for your questions and staying on. And this time, second time, I'd like to pass on to Nina Etemizyan, our Vice President for Human Rights, Education and Empowerment, to close this event. Ms. Etemizyan has more than 20 years of leadership experience in international development, focusing on human capacity development programs. Nina has lived and worked across the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. She is a native Arabic speaker, is fluent in French and Armenian, and holds a master's degree in international education from the Harvard's Graduate School of Education. Nina, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Olga. And a sincere thank you to the panelists Megan Longstrom, Guillermo, Galarza, Shakhnoza, Khassanova, and Mohammed Nazrul Dipto. The Winrock team and the global CTIP community gathered at this event appreciate the four of you sharing your knowledge and insights, challenges and solutions to preventing child trafficking and supporting survivors. We had over 100 participants join us today from around the world, including from Asia, from Africa, Europe, and North America. This global representation of stakeholders speaks to the fact that children are trafficked in every country around the world. It is also an acknowledgement of the urgency with which we must continue to address child trafficking until all children are able to live lives free of exploitation. Thank you, Megan, for highlighting the unique experience of child TIP survivors and the work Polaris does through the Resilience Fund. We know how critical it is for survivors to have voice and choice, to have agency and control over their own lives. And this is exactly what Polaris's Resilience Fund does with its trust-based model that contributes to stronger communities where fewer people are at risk of trafficking. I appreciated hearing from Guillermo also about ICMEC's efforts to fight the sexual exploitation of children globally. We learned how the development of information and communication technologies have been affecting how children are recruited, exploited, and rescued as well. ICMEC's partnerships and collaboration with law enforcement agencies reminds us that law enforcement personnel also need the right tools to counter the exploitation of children. Thank you to Shakhnoza for presenting how Sana Sezim works in a region with open borders and where there is a substantial flow of internal and cross-border migration. Sana Sezim's work delivering child-sensitive, trauma-informed support to survivors of child trafficking and children accompanying migrant laborers is critical. The solutions you noted, such as enhanced training programs, child-friendly reporting systems, clear guidelines for recovery services, a child-centric legal framework, and the legal framework for ethnic minorities are crucial to addressing child TIP. Additionally, the point made by Anastasia in her video, sharing recommendations about supporting child survivors' family is very critical as well. Providing wraparound services for the survivor and their parents or guardians is a key way to reduce stigma and decrease the likelihood of returning to exploitative situation. And thank you very much, Winrock colleague Dipto, for sensitizing us to the scale of child trafficking in Bangladesh and the crucial work that Fight Slavery and Trafficking in Persons does to support child survivors. While there are many challenges to preventing and responding to child trafficking and child marriage, efforts are clearly underway. Collaboration, implementation of legislation, support for the rule of law, appropriate use of technological advancement, private sector partnerships, and increased funding are making a difference in addressing child TIP and supporting survivors as they embark on a journey of transformative change. As was stated in Georgette Dabroy's opening remarks and emphasized by each speaker, we work in partnership to end the exploitation of children, to support child survivors of TIP, and to reduce vulnerabilities of communities at risk for trafficking by implementing community-based approaches and trauma-informed practices. None of us do this work alone. It is through our partnerships with survivors, persons with lived experience, civil society, host governments, the private sector, and communities that we will eradicate child trafficking. Thank you again to our guests and to our attendees for taking the time to attend this event. I wish you all a good rest of your day and a good evening as well.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You.
Good evening, bye.
Thank you.